Have you ever forced your hands to stop shaking and failed? David had, for years. He fought weakness constantly, hid it well enough, trained his body hard, until his mind stayed silent about the fear underneath. Last Tuesday, standing outside a boardroom he'd rehearsed for all night, his hands shook anyway. Years of forcing strength hadn't erased a single thing. Genghis Khan once faced that same shaking hand and never tried to kill it. That's the truth nobody tells you about becoming unbreakable. Stay with me, because what happens next changes Maybe you're on your couch right now, phone in hand, pretending you're just scrolling. Maybe you're in bed, lights off, everyone else asleep. Wherever you are, you already know why you clicked on this. Something in you has been shaking too, and you've spent years trying to make it stop. David spent most of his life doing exactly that. He grew up believing that strong men didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't let anyone see the cracks. So he built a version of himself that never cracked in public. Gym at 5 in the morning, cold showers he hated, a voice in meetings that never wavered, even when his stomach twisted underneath the table. He thought he was building strength. Really, he was just building a better hiding place. Nobody taught him the difference. His father called emotions a distraction. His coaches called fear something you push through, never something you sit with. So David pushed. He pushed through breakups without grieving them. He pushed through failed pitches without asking why they failed. Every time something hurt, he buried it fast and moved on before anyone could notice, including himself. That kind of survival has a cost, and it isn't obvious at first. Psychologists who study emotional suppression have found something strange. Fighting a feeling doesn't remove it. It just moves the weight somewhere else. The heart rate climbs. The mind stays alert long after the danger has passed. Suppression doesn't make the fear disappear. It just makes it louder, in places you can't see. Until your body starts keeping score, your mind refuses to. Centuries before any of that research existed, a boy on the Mongolian steppe learned this the hard way. Long before he became the conqueror the world would fear, Temujin was a 9-year-old whose father was poisoned by rivals, whose family was abandoned by their own clan, left to survive a brutal winter without protection or name. He wasn't taught to be fearless. He was terrified, hungry, and powerless, and there was no version of pretending that could fix any of it. Here's what most retellings leave out. Temujin didn't win by convincing himself the fear wasn't there. He won because he stopped spending energy hiding it from himself. He let the powerlessness sit in him like a weight he'd carry, not a stain he had to scrub out before he could move. That single difference changed everything about how he built the years that followed. David didn't know any of this yet. All he knew was that his hands had shaken outside that boardroom, and no amount of forcing had stopped them. He sat in his car afterward, gripping the wheel, furious at himself for something he'd spent a decade trying to outrun. He assumed the shaking meant he'd failed. He assumed it meant the years of discipline hadn't worked. What if that assumption was the actual problem? What if the fear was never something to defeat, and every year he'd spent fighting it had only taught his body to fight harder against itself? He didn't have an answer yet. He just had a memory of a story about a boy who'd once been just as afraid. And somehow, that boy hadn't needed to win the fight against fear at all. He just needed to stop treating it like a war. But David didn't understand that yet, so he did what he'd always done. He decided the shaking meant he needed to try harder, not differently. If discipline hadn't been enough, he'd just add more of it. More reps at the gym. More rehearsal in front of the mirror. More silent instruction to himself that fear was weakness, and weakness had no place in a man who wanted to win. The next pitch meeting came 2 weeks later, and David walked in convinced he'd fixed the problem. He'd practiced his opening line until it felt like muscle memory. He'd told himself over and over that this time his hands would stay still. For the first 4 minutes, they did. Then, a partner across the table asked a question David hadn't prepared for, a small crack in his rehearsed armor, and everything he tried to force down came rushing back at once. His voice caught mid-sentence. His hands found the edge of the table and gripped it, visibly, in front of 6 people, who were deciding whether to trust him with their money. He recovered. Technically, he finished the pitch. But he watched their faces shift, watched the moment their confidence in him quietly dropped. And he knew exactly why. 900 years earlier, a young Temujin faced something strikingly similar. After escaping his captors, half-starved and alone, he tried the same instinct. David just had force confidence, act unshaken, convince the men around him that fear had never touched him. It didn't work. The warriors who might have followed him saw through the performance immediately, because desperation dressed up as certainty still moves like desperation. His forced bravado nearly cost him the alliance that would define the rest of his life. What changed wasn't his fear. It was his strategy. He stopped trying to project an absence of fear and started letting people see that he'd survived it, which is an entirely different kind of proof. Men didn't follow him because he seemed untouchable. They followed him because he'd clearly been touched by everything and kept moving anyway. David didn't know that story yet, not in any detail he could use. All he had, sitting in his car outside that second failed pitch, was the growing suspicion that forcing the sheikh to stop had never once worked. Not with Temujin. Not with him. Not with anyone who'd actually paid attention to how fear works instead of how they wished it worked. If you've made it this far, you've probably already recognized your own version of that boardroom. Maybe it's a stage, a phone call you keep avoiding, a conversation you rehearse in the shower and never actually have. Subscribing costs you nothing, but it means you'll be here for the part where David finally figures out what actually works. Because it isn't what either of you have been taught. Because here's what David still hadn't grasped. He kept treating the sheikh as evidence of a battle he was losing. Nobody had ever told him it wasn't a battle at all. Nobody had explained that the men history remembers as unbreakable weren't the ones who never shook. They were the ones who let the shaking exist without needing to win an argument against it first. He was about to find that out, though not in the way he expected. 3 days after the second failed pitch, David found himself at his uncle's house, the only person in his life who'd never once told him to toughen up. His uncle had spent a decade studying behavioral psychology before switching careers, and he listened to the whole story without interrupting, without the usual advice about breathing exercises or positive self-talk. Then he asked one question that undid everything. What exactly are you trying to get rid of? David said the shaking. Obviously, the fear. Whatever it was that made him look weak in front of people who needed to trust him. His uncle shook his head slowly. You're not trying to get rid of it. You're trying to win a fight against a part of your own nervous system, and you've never once won that fight. Because it isn't a fight. It's information. That single sentence landed somewhere David couldn't immediately process. His uncle kept going, explaining research on identity-based acceptance, a growing body of work showing that people who stop resisting a feeling and instead let it exist without judgment recover their composure faster than people who fight to suppress it. The fighting is what keeps the nervous system locked in alarm. The acceptance is what tells it the danger has passed. It wasn't resignation. Nobody was suggesting David give up or stop caring. The shift was smaller and stranger than that. Instead of standing in that boardroom, silently screaming at his hands to stop, what if he let them shake and kept talking anyway? What if the goal was never a body that felt nothing, but a man who no longer needed his body to feel nothing before he could act? This was the same shift that had turned a terrified, abandoned boy into the man who would eventually unite the steppe. Temujin never stopped feeling the fear of betrayal that had followed him since childhood. Every alliance he built afterward, every battle he entered. Some part of him still carried that 9-year-old's memory of watching his own clan walk away. He didn't erase it. He stopped needing to. The fear became a fact he carried, not an enemy he had to defeat before every decision. That's the part almost nobody tells you about strength. It was never the absence of shaking hands. It was a man who let his hands shake and still reached for the sword anyway. David sat with that for a long time after his uncle finished talking. He thought about every gym session at 5 in the morning, every cold shower, every rehearsed line in the mirror, all of it aimed at a target that had never existed. He hadn't needed to become someone who didn't feel fear. He'd needed to become someone who didn't need the fear to leave before he moved. He thought about the boardroom again, the 6 faces watching his hands grip the table, and for the first time he didn't feel humiliated by the memory. He felt something closer to recognition. The shaking hadn't been proof he was failing. It had been proof he was still human enough to care about the outcome. And somewhere along the way, he'd mistaken that for a flaw instead of a fact. His uncle said one more thing before David left that night. The people who scared you most growing up, the ones who seemed untouchable. They weren't untouchable. They just stopped needing you to believe that they were. David didn't have an answer for that yet, but something in his chest had already started to loosen, like a fist he hadn't realized he'd been making for 15 years. 2 weeks passed before David got the chance to test any of it. A third pitch meeting landed on his calendar, this time with a client twice the size of the first 2. The kind of account that could change the direction of his entire year. The old David would have spent those 2 weeks trying to engineer certainty. Instead, he did something that felt almost embarrassingly small. He decided, walking into that room, that if his hands shook, he would let them. He didn't tell himself the fear was gone. He didn't pretend the stakes weren't real. He just stopped making the shaking the enemy he had to defeat before he was allowed to speak. The meeting started, and within the first 2 minutes, an old trigger resurfaced exactly the way it always had. A senior partner leaned back, arms crossed, and asked the same kind of sharp, unprepared question that had unraveled David twice before. His pulse spiked instantly. His hands found the table's edge again. The same reflex, the same old panic, knocking at the same old door. This time, though, he didn't fight it. He let his fingers grip the table and kept talking anyway, voice steadier than his hands, sentence by sentence, without waiting for the shaking to stop first. Nobody in the room seemed to notice what he'd expected them to notice. A few noticed something else instead, a kind of grounded conviction that hadn't been there in his earlier pitches. The sound of a man who clearly cared about what he was saying, rather than a man performing confidence he didn't feel. He got the account, but the account wasn't actually the part that mattered most to him afterward. What mattered was that this wasn't a lucky fluke, a single good day he couldn't repeat. It was proof the shift his uncle described actually held up under real pressure, not just in a quiet living room where nothing was at stake. Temujin faced this same test more than once. The step didn't offer a single moment of triumph and then leave him alone. Rival clans kept probing for the same old cracks, kept testing whether the boy who once lost everything had actually changed or simply gotten better at hiding the same fear. Each time, the answer held. Not because "You've gotten calmer," she said one afternoon, watching him field a difficult client call that would have wrecked him a year earlier. She meant it as a compliment about his composure, but David almost laughed, because calm wasn't quite the right word. His hands still shook sometimes. His pulse still spiked before hard conversations. What had actually changed was smaller and stranger than calm. He'd simply stopped needing any of that to stop before he opened his mouth. She didn't know about the boardroom failures, the car rides afterward gripping the wheel, the conversation with his uncle that had quietly rearranged something inside him. All she saw was a man who no longer flinched at pressure the way he used to, and she assumed that meant the fear itself was gone. It wasn't. He'd just stopped asking it to leave before he could function. There's a version of this same recognition buried in how history remembers Temujin, long after he became Genghis Khan. The men who eventually feared him most, rival warlords who'd once dismissed the orphaned boy from a broken clan, weren't afraid of a man without weakness. Historians studying his rise point to something else entirely. His enemies feared a man who had clearly survived everything meant to break him, and never once needed to prove it hadn't touched him. That absence of performance was what unsettled them. A man defending his strength can be baited, provoked, unraveled. A man who has nothing left to defend cannot. That was the truth David had been circling for months, without naming it directly. The people who scare us most, the ones who seem untouchable, were rarely untouched. They'd just stopped needing anyone, including themselves, to believe they were. He thought about the version of himself that used to exist, the one who trained at 5 in the morning purely to outrun a feeling he refused to sit with. That man hadn't been weak. He'd just been fighting the wrong war, aiming discipline at a target that could never actually be defeated. Because the target was never real to begin with. Now, sitting across from clients, walking into rooms that once made his stomach twist, David carried something different. Not fearlessness, something closer to permission. Permission to shake, to hesitate, to feel the same nervous system fire the same old alarm, without treating any of it as proof he'd failed before he'd even started. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight, the same one David eventually had to answer for himself. What have you spent years trying to force out of existence? Assuming that was the only way to become someone stronger, what if the shaking was never the problem? What if the only thing standing between you and the man you're trying to become was the belief that he couldn't shake at all? You already know the answer somewhere in you. You've just been arguing with it for a long time. You don't need the fear to disappear before you become who you're capable of being. You just need to stop negotiating with it. Comment the one thing you've been fighting, instead of accepting the thing you're finally done forcing down. That's where this actually starts for you.